same thing using CloudFormation. So earlier you heard about OpsWorks and Elastic Beanstalk. We also have CloudFormation, which is roll your own description of your infrastructure. And then I will talk about a highly available WordPress setup with an elastic load balancer, so we'll create one. And also scaling group, so that's that ability to go from 2 servers to 10 servers as the load goes up and then back down to 2. And Amazon Elastic File System. So if you were at the last user group, I mentioned Elastic File System as a new service. And it's basically NFS v4 in AWS. And it's now out in preview, so we'll have a look at it. It's in Oregon. You basically just create an NFS volume and you create an endpoint in each region. And it's very convenient for WordPress, because if you have 2 or 3 or 4 servers, they all point at the same file system. So when you upload content or you install plugins or do whatever, you've just got one file system that's shared. NFS stands for Network File System, so it presents it on the network to the host. So we'll have a look at that. So we might, by the end of it, have a look at EC2, auto-scaling, load balancer, that's for our highly available version. Elastic File System, that's the new service that I mentioned. Oh, of course, WordPress uses a database, so we'll create an Amazon RDS, Relational Database Service. So if you haven't seen RDS creation, we'll do one now. Has anyone created an RDS instance before?
Yeah, too expensive.
Too expensive. We'll do one in free tier. T2 Micro is free. Only for a year, of course. CloudFormation, we'll have a quick look at CloudFormation script which deploys a WordPress install. S3, I'll probably do an S3 roll on my EC2 instance and back up to S3. So these are all best practices for cloud architecture, but with a very simple use case of a WordPress site. Oh, I've even put CloudFront and Route 53. We probably won't get to them on the end, but it's easy to add a content delivery network and use Route 53 for DNS. So they're like, there's a bunch of services there, although the use case is quite simple. So I'll quickly go through this so we can get started. You choose your region. In this case, we'll use Singapore inside AWS. Singapore has 2 availability zones. Best practice is say that you deploy into both availability zones. Inside the AWS region, what's carved out is a virtual private cloud for you. You all have a default VPC in your account. So we'll use the default VPC. I'll talk about the components of that just so you're familiar with the terms and the concept of architecture of the cloud. So the default VPC has 2 VPC subnets. Okay, notice subnets do not span across availability zones. There's one subnet in each availability zone. And there's also what's here is a routing table. And this is in the default VPC. It connects all of the VPC subnets in your virtual private cloud, routes them all between each other. Okay? Also in the default VPC is one of these. That is known as an internet gateway. It connects your virtual private cloud to the internet. Now you can build your own virtual private cloud without an internet gateway, and then you get to it with Direct Connect or VPN. But the default has an internet gateway. Okay? That's all standard. That is all built for you. You don't do anything. It's your default VPC. So I'll fade out the bits that are already built, and then we'll build one EC2 instance, one RDS instance. We'll use an elastic IP address. And notice here I've put S3. I put it outside of not only your VPC, but outside of the 2 availability zones, because it's spread across both. So it's relevant that that is just outside the diagram, because it's not in your VPC, it's outside your VPC. But I might add, if you were familiar with that, we now have S3 endpoints inside your VPC. So just another feature to be aware of. Okay, so that's a quick overview of stuff. Let's go. Here. So I'm going to create an RDS instance first, and you'll see how easy it is. Some of you may have done it before. Oh, another little tip, best practice, edit. You can chuck your things into this top bar, and then you have a shortcut.
Well, that's new.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the ones I want to use for this demo are up in the top bar. RDS. Singapore. I've already got one, but let's launch another one. MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, SQL Server all supported. It says for production use multi-availability zone. Shall we use multi? No, let's use a single availability zone. So we can use RDS, use free tier. So if you operate in one availability zone, you can actually operate a relational database for free for a year. If you go in 2 availability zones, there is some cost. Okay, so basically you can choose your version of MySQL. It's that easy. DBT2 Micro, this is free tier, but of course you could choose something with 8 vCPUs and 60 gig of RAM. Of course, they're not free. We'll go with a 1 vCPU and 1 gig of RAM. Multi-AZ or multi-AZ, I'll say no for the moment. We're just going to do a single availability zone deployment. And with 5 gig of SSD. Okay? We'll call this my user group, is the instance identifier. DB username, DB user. Master password. I'm going to get this password from here because when I install WordPress, I have to put it in the console so you can see it. So I'm not going to use a secret password. Okay, next. Default VPC. You remember I said every account has a default VPC with an internet gateway and a routing table and all that stuff and 2 availability zones. I'm going to use the default VPC. It's suitable for a load of stuff as long as you want it internet facing. You can see I've got a couple of others in there, we're not going to use them. Publicly available, do you know what, I'm going to say no, because best practice for my database, I'm going to say not publicly facing, so no internet IP address. When I create my EC2 instance, I will create a security group on my database that only allows my EC2 instance to access it. So best practice is security. So we might as well do it properly. Security groups. We'll create a new security group and then we'll edit it. DB name, we'll call it my user group DB. Just call it my user group. Port 3306, standard MySQL port. Enable encryption. Notice within ODB you can actually have encrypted MySQL database, which is pretty good. Now this is one of the real key features of RDS as a service. Backup. Keep my backups for 7 days. Done. Backup window, anytime you like, or let's choose a window for a backup. It's in UTC, which is effectively GMT. So let's go 8 PM GMT, which is about 4 AM local time. So I've just created a half-hour window at 4 AM for my backups. So done, taken care of. Maintenance, minor upgrade, auto minor upgrades, all those new little features and patches and bug fixes that come out from MySQL, auto implement, yes. Select a window, yes. Monday, because we're good admins, we'll make it Tuesday, and we will do it at 9 o'clock, which is an hour after our backup. So at 4 AM we back up, and at 5 AM we do minor database upgrades. Launch DB, right. So that's how quickly you can launch a relational database. But not only launch a relational database, have it backed up and incrementally upgraded. And if I'd have chosen 2 availability zones, have it very highly available. Now you can add read replicas, and you can do snapshots, and you can do cross-region read replicas, all in this RDS console. We'll just go with a basic one. Now, endpoint. So it says creating, it takes a couple of minutes to create. Endpoint is how we're going to connect to it from our EC2 instance, so we'll do that in a moment. Okay, pretty easy. Let's create a T2 micro, including a new security group. So in my handy shortcuts, I'll go to EC2. No running instances, notice. So I'll launch an instance. Again, I'm going to use another T2 micro. So in case you didn't know about the free tier, you can have a T2 micro in EC2 and a T2 micro in RDS in free tier. So everything we're creating so far, you can do in free tier in the first year. And even after the free tier, it's like, some dollars a month, not many. So 1 vCPU, 1 gig of memory. If you haven't seen this, you can see, look, you've got 36 CPUs, 60 gigs of RAM, and up to 244 gigs of RAM in a memory optimized instance. Okay, we'll go with EC2, 1 instance, subnet. We'll choose our subnet A in this case. IAM role. Now this is interesting. I can assign an IAM role. I've created a role called S3 All Access. That's an identity access management role that has access to read and write to S3. Now, I can by default apply that role to my EC2 instance. So I can use my EC2 instance to do things in S3, like back up my WordPress site. Right? So we'll do that with the command line, another tool we'll use. Shutdown behavior, stop, that's fine. Add storage, we've got an 8 gig SSD general purpose volume. We could add another volume, but we won't. Tag, we'll call this my user group. Configure security group. So let's add a rule. So as well as SSH, we want inbound HTTP or AC from anywhere. We'll call this my user group. HTTP and SSH inbound. And I'm going to call that security group my user group. Let's just get to launching. There we go. Launch key pair. I'll use my ID RSA single port. I'll show you another little tip here. If you've ever logged into a Linux host, you need to specify the key every time you log in. Now, I've created a certificate for all the different regions. I've saved them in the .ssh directory, and then I've used a file called sshconfig, which configures my local SSH, to look at the fully qualified domain name, work out which region I'm connected to, and use the relevant key. So I don't have to specify the key when I log into a host. And you'll see that in a minute. I can just SSH to the host name. Don't have to put the username, don't have to put the key, I just get straight in. And I'll show you how you do that. Handy little tip. So let's launch the instance. If you remember, I made a security group called MyUG. When we go back to the relational database we just created, I'm gonna make a rule in the security group that says allow access from any host in the security group called MyUG, which you saw me just create. So that means the database can only be accessed from the web server and from nowhere else. So good practice security, right? Because that's what we should do.
Then you cannot SSH into your RDS instance.
You can't SSH to your RDS instance, correct? You cannot. You cannot SSH to your RDS.
By default, you shouldn't be able to SSH.
That's it. The host that it's running on is kind of invisible to you. There is in the console you can tell the MySQL slow query log and various logs that MySQL generates, but the actual operating system is kind of abstracted. Okay, so one more thing I'm going to do, because it's good, and in case you haven't seen it, I'm going to create an elastic IP address. So this is how easy it is. Are you sure you want to allocate a new IP address? Yes, allocate. New IP address allocated. Now, if you create an elastic IP address, if you attach it to a host, no charge, it's free. When it's not associated to a host and is sitting in your account being unused, there's a very small charge, some cents a month. So I'm going to associate that address with an instance. There we go, my user group running. And that means, if I were running a site, I could have it stay on the same IP address.
So we can have this associated with an instance for as long as you want.
As long as you want, yeah.
The same IP address.
Yep. We call it an elastic IP address. I don't exactly know why it's elastic. But generally the concept with AWS is use DNS name and IP address exchange, but you can use an elastic IP address, and then you don't pay for it as long as it's attached to a host, and you have it as long as you want it. And it's kind of sort of like not best practice cloud, because it's meant to be cloud, meant to be this kind of ever-changing thing. But of course, they're pretty useful to a lot of people a lot of times. So I've created one. Right, my one running instance. There's a public IP address, elastic IP address. See, it's been assigned. Let me grab the public DNS name. See what I said here. Create associated elastic IP. I've done that. Edit the RDS security group to allow inbound from EC2. I'll do that before I log in. So let's quickly pop back to RDS. I've got two. One was called My User Group. See, my endpoint has now appeared. It's called My User Group, long, fully qualified domain name. I have a security group, which is called RDS Launch Wizard. And what I'm going to say in my security group, on the inbound rule, MySQL, protocol TCP, port 3306, source. I'm not quite sure what it's got source, but what I want to do in the source is say if you remember, I created that security group called My User Group when I created the EC2 instance. That is the source. So anything that's in that security group can now access my RDS database. And you will see that in just a moment. So, back to my running instance. Grab the public DNS name. Now, I did say another tip and trick is, if I say, I'll do a bit smaller, turn bigger so you can see. SSH, host name, no key, no nothing, and I'm logged in. Now, I'll show you how I did that. I just logged out. If I go less.ssh config, this is my SSH config. That's the regular expression for the host name. So AP Southeast 1, user is EC2 user, that's the default username. Identity file, .ssh, ID RSA, single port pair. And I've done that for every region. See, hash is simply a comment, identified by the host name, username, handy, right? So if you want a copy of that config file, email me and I'll give you a copy, and it's quite handy because then what you can do is you just go SSH host name for anything you created and you can log in.
I didn't know you could use wildcards it's in your SSH config file.
Yeah. So it's got Regex support. It's quite handy anyway. So that's the instance we created. Uptime 2 minutes, so we know that's the one. So if I go MySQL minus new DB user host, and then we go RDS. Check one other thing. Edit the address, log in, install some stuff. Actually, I can't use anything until I'm installed, so I'm going to do sudo yum install -y. That means don't prompt me for a question, just go ahead and do it. HTTPD, PHP, MySQL, MySQL Common, and MySQL 55. So let's go install those things. Oops. There they go. Test the connection to the DB. So MySQL -u DB user -host. Let's get our what we call the endpoint on the user group. There it is, endpoint. I go copy is what I really want. There it is. Can you actually capture it?
Copy the flow.
There we go. We've got it this time. -p. Enter password. I think I use that password. There we go. Show databases. There's my UG. So that's the RDS instance created and the database in there. Use my user group. Show tables. No tables, right? So the RDS group's been created. The database is automatically created. I've got a user, I've got an endpoint, and it's only accessible from my user. So it's kind of sort of normalish best practice. Okay, tested that. Configure WordPress and Apache. Right. What this does is, if I just log out of there, cd to my home directory, I can go and get the latest WordPress from there. I cd to var www. I untar zx of a verbose file, this guy, unpack it. I do a bit of a shuffle so that it's not in a nested directory called WordPress, and then I do some chown Apache dot. So chown is change owner, Apache is the owner. If you do change owner Apache : Apache, it's user group. If you do Apache dot means use the default group for that user. Alright, so a little bit of short syntax. Apache dot will give you the user and that user's default group. So just good practice. To group minus capital R Apache, and then the dot directory. So I made slightly different permissions for the dot directory. Then to config is turn HTTPD on, so to start the web server, and server start HTTPD. So if I'm not mistaken, I probably reckon I can run all of that. Oops.
That's fun.
Go. So go get the latest RDGZ, unpack it. There we go. Do some stuff. Now, in part, I've saved that in a file because when we do auto-scaling, I'm going to put those commands into something that's called user data. Right, so everything I've done to that host, I'm going to make into what's called a launch configuration for my auto-scaling group. So you heard Ian talk about disposable infrastructure. All of those things will happen every time my auto-scaling group creates a host, and then it can just throw it away because if it needs a new one, it just runs all of those things. So we know they roughly work. Okay.
So you're going to put them in the launch configuration.
I'll put those in the launch configuration.
Launch
slight variation
is what? What is the language that it uses? Is it JSON?
There's different ones, but launch configuration in the case that I will use is shell script. So when an EC2 instance comes up, it will run something called launch D.
So anything you put in that file that will be run.
It will run, yeah. So it's just basically a bunch of shell commands. So it's a very, very primitive version of what, say, Optworks does, but it's something specific to AWS EC2. You can just put some shell commands that will come in when the machine comes up. Okay, I also said, we've now got our WordPress installed there. So if I do AWS S3, if you haven't used the AWS command line, right? So you go AWS help, and it will tell you all the different things you've got there, right? All the different services, auto scaling, cloud formation, cloud HSM. Then if you do AWS S3 help, now I've got the help to S3. Now if I do AWS S3 make bucket help, it gives me the help from mb, make bucket. Following mb command creates a bucket. Okay? So pretty easy to use the command line. It comes as default as part of EC2 Linux, right? So you don't have to set it up on your computer at all. This instance that I've just deployed is fully configured to use AWS command line, and I've granted it a role that I call S3 all access. So if I try to create a Dynamo table, it won't work. But if I try and create an S3 bucket, let's see what happens. S3 : / my user group. Make bucket, so created bucket. Now, a little added feature there, I haven't had to pass any credentials around or save any credentials on there or anything. I just said give it that role. And it doesn't actually save the credentials for that role on that host. What it does, for your information, is it's a pretty useful architecture for the cloud and it's fundamentally part of identity access management. It queries local data, user data, whatever it is, and it gets some temporary credentials that it uses. And it accesses S3 with those temporary credentials. Those credentials are rotated about every 40 minutes. So you've got rotating keys that the host is constantly getting from user data, not user data, it's paradigm I needed. Like the 169 URL. So, AWS S3, if you haven't used it before, sync. I'm going to sync all the data in my current directory to my new S3 bucket. Okay, so I'm now backing that up. Sync will only copy files that have changed into the last sync. So if you chuck that line into etc cron.weekly, you've then got a weekly backup, only backing up files that have changed. We've got a database that's already being backed up and going through maintenance, and we've got a reasonably secure environment for the database that's getting there. Okay? So I'll let that finish backing up. Add it to etc cron.daily if you want to do a daily backup actually. I'll let that finish, just because I want it. 960 of 1192, so not far. Okay. VI recorded my UG backup. And we'll go hash bang bin bash. Oops, I wanted my S3 command there. Just get that now. Okay, I've now got that backing up weekly to S3 and only backing up the differences. So that's it basically for the manually created one. I will, just to show you that it really did do something, if I go to my EC2 instance and I go running instances and I get the public DNS name, and I go there. There we go, there's my WordPress installed, and you can say, let's go, and you can connect to the database, and you've seen what's there. Now, to give you an idea of what CloudFormation does, CloudFormation, there's Obsworks and Elastic Beanstalk, which you heard Ian talking about. We're going to create a new CloudFormation. We're going to call it My User Group. We're going to go for a template. We'll go for a WordPress blog. Notice it gives me an S3 URL. If I open that URL, that's the CloudFormation template. Create SSH, DB name, DB user. Similar questions to what we just did for RDS. It just fills them in on the CloudFormation template. And then that CloudFormation template will run. So I go back to here, I say next. Oops, go previous. So DB, WordPress DB, so you recognize this from when we created our own RDS, but this is the CloudFormation template. Let's go and get that same password again. DB user, same user. It's going to be a D small, that'll be fine. Use my key. And I'll just quickly quick through that so we don't spend too long on it. Oh, invalid DB password failed. Must contain only alphanumeric characters. I meant an error in the password. Wonderful. DB password. Okay, see if I can get through that. There we go, and that's CloudFormation doing exactly what we've done manually. So it creates a stack. All right, I won't spend any more time on that. What I will quickly show you now is Elastic File System. It says region unsupported because I'm in Singapore. Switches me to US Oregon. This is in preview, so it's not a full production service. It's only in one region, but it will be coming around, and it's pretty useful for scalable websites. So create a file system. You say, remember I mentioned about default VPC, there it is. Because I'm in Oregon, there's 3 availability zones. There's an endpoint in every availability zone. You go next, name, we'll call it my user group. Next, 3 regions, tag, create file system. That easy. So I've just created a file system. Notice it didn't ask me for a size, because it's an elastic file system. You don't specify a size. It starts off as 0, and it gets bigger as you drop objects into it. Okay? So I'm in Oregon now, as you can see from here. I've got an elastic file system. I've got an RDS instance. If you've got enough energy left, I can show you creating that auto-scaling group. Okay, so the elastic file system exists. The relational database exists. So review the file system, review the RDS instance, it's there. And in that, so I've got another elastic file system where I've got some WordPress code already deployed. So let's create that launch configuration using the user data below with the WordPress user group demos and security group. Notice user data, bin bash, install, NFS utils, HTTP, PHP, MySQL, MySQL 55. The only one in addition there is NFS utils because I need the NFS utilities to mount the elastic file system, okay? Then it's going to say mount minus T, that's type, NFSv4. This curl of this user data, latest metadata placement availability zone, that gives me the availability zone name.
The one that this instance is running on.
Yes, so every instance will get the right availability zone and mount it on var So that's my launch configuration. I'll see how fast I can get that created so we can wrap up and have questions. Launch configuration. Okay, so notice there's no instances running. I'll create a launch configuration. I'll make it, same Amazon Linux, I'll make it T2 micro, configure the details, I'll call it my group, IAM role, we don't need it, but I'll put an S3 access role. Advanced details, here's the bit, user data as text, alright? So I'll just grab this, user data. There we go. Add storage, next to my correct security group, next security group. I will create a new one and I'll call it my user group. HTTP. So for these hosts, because they're web servers, we want HTTP 480 above. Review. Okay, it's done. Create launch configuration. Use my key. If you remember, my keys are all set up to automatically work. That's a launch configuration. It's a bit like creating a host, but it's a launch configuration, and those commands will run on every host that's created. The next part of it is create an auto-scaling group that uses that configuration. It's called, there's the launch configuration, my user group name, my user group as well. Start with, let's say, 2 instances. Subnet, right. I've said 2 instances, so I'm going to choose availability zone A and B. Okay? And then health check grace period, I'm going to make it 5 seconds, so it sets itself up faster. Scaling policies. This is where you would put basically at 50% CPU, make another instance. I'm not going to do it in the interest of time. I'm going to say configure tags, name, my user group, that'll be the host, review, create auto-scaling group, done. Okay, so create an ELB is the very last part of that. Close. Notice, I'll just check here, you should probably see 2 instances are about to spin up. There we go, 2 instances, status initializing. because my launch configuration said always have 2 instances, so it just basically started 2 instances. They're brand new. And if I go load balancer, create a new one, I'll call it my user group, or 18, assign security group. If you remember, I said use that security group. Health check. I happen to know I have a file called read.html, and maybe 5 seconds. And add these 2 instances. I'm actually going to add my load balancer. Okay, your load balancer created. So that's it. I've made it highly available. In fact, I can show you what that looks like. There's an error there. Health check timeout must be less than interval. It's because I reduced the interval too much. But basically, what I've built there is that. Now, there's an EC2 instance on both sides. That's the Elastic file system, which is presented to both hosts. And that's the MySQL master and slave. If I create the dual one there. And that's the auto-scaling policy that sits outside the group. You can add S2 static content and E53 for DNS.
But how did we add an auto-scaling policy before having a load balancer? What is it going to do? It's just going to spin up instances that are not really getting traffic.
Correct. They won't get any traffic. All you do is in ELB, you connect the auto-scaling group to the ELB.
But did you do that when you just created the load balancer?
I didn't do it. It's one other step.
Oh, okay.
So
that's the last step, basically.
It's the last step. So that it didn't create it actually. It's in here. Where is it? Cross-zone load balancing, security groups. It's in there. You just click edit and you create it.
Because without that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have an auto-scaling group.
Exactly. It won't work. You won't get traffic. I'm getting timeout from the back here because we've run over time. But that's basically a fully HA, scalable, backed up, resilient WordPress install in 20 minutes.